And Andrea says, I think you're supposed to keep going now. Yeah, we changed the order up, of course, because this morning we're doing communion together as we do it here in 11:11. And we haven't done it in some time, and it feels like as we come back from COVID and come back kind of gathering as we do slowly and figuring it out, that certain rituals we've sort of taken our time figuring out how to do that. And it didn't feel as right for us. I know a lot of the churches tried to do the online kind of communion, and I got emails from folks saying, like, I was enjoying cookies and mimosas while the other folks were doing communion. And, I'm not saying that was a lot of people. I'm just saying that I realized, that goes on. And so I wanted to sort of have a chance for us to kind of begin to feel what it's like to be back in community. And so I feel like this is a really important ritual, but it is one in which we reframe, because like a lot of things in 11:11, we do a lot of reframing given some of our histories with church and bad experiences, difficult experiences, abusive experiences. So we kind of rethink and reframe how we understand that. So with that in mind, I want to share this story and just a couple of thoughts about this text and this I'm calling this series Resurrection Stories, and then we're going to take a look at different kinds of stories of astonishment. As you remember last week on Easter, our theme was astonishment. So I'll start off with this quick little story. So these two communities live side by side. It's a very old story. It happened a long, long time ago. These two ancient communities, one was a Jewish Christian community, and the other was a Jewish community. Now, they were in the diaspora. They were in exile after the temple had fallen, so this was 2nd century. And these two communities were side by side, living pretty amicably, getting along well enough, even though they had differences. The Christian Jews were sort of the followers of Jesus, but they were considered just one more sect of Jews. And then the Jewish Jews were much more orthodox and rigid. And they tolerated each other for a time. But after a while, toleration led into impatience, and that led into judgment. And before you knew it, one community was judging the other community as inappropriate or wrong or flat out just breaking the piety codes. And so they had all sorts of conflicts until finally they decided someone had to leave. And so they began talking about how this would be decided, and finally the leaders of each community decided they would have a debate, and the debate would be in sign language. And so they said this would be fine, and the Christian community pulled together their finest, most scholared, educated disciples. The ones who had followed down the lineage from Jesus. They really knew the law, they knew the Christian law as well, and then they called forth Brother Andrew was his name. He knew everything. He was going to be perfect. They didn't have a chance, this Jewish community over here. And so the Jewish community went looking around, and they didn't have any rabbis, any rabbis that were there at the time. And the closest thing they had to a rabbi was the woman who was the chef or the cook in the kitchen in the synagogue. And so they said, well, all right, do you understand things? She says, I'm pretty smart. They said, well, all right then. They didn't know what else to do, so she went up against Brother Andrew. The two of them had agreed they would meet the next morning, sit on either side of the table, and just with sign language, they would determine who was the smartest, who was the cleverest, and the one who lost, of course, would have to leave, move off some distance. Well, the Christians had challenged, they started. And Brother Andrew held up 3 fingers. Well, with that, the cook, she looked around at her community, she looked back at Brother Andrew, and she held up 1 finger. Brother Andrew seemed a little troubled by this. He thought for a moment, and then he made a motion that sort of looked like almost a rainbow as he hit his hand in his fist in his hand, and then he made a long arch and pointed away. This seemed to trouble the cook for a moment. She wasn't sure what was going on. She looked back at her own community, and they urged her on, and so she put her fist in her hand and started pounding. And that really troubled Andrew. You could see beads of sweat on his forehead as he looked over to one of the younger acolytes, one of the trainers there, and he sent him off, and the acolyte came back with a chalice and a loaf of bread. And Brother Andrew set the bread and the chalice on the table. And at this, the cook, she looked around, and she got a sack that was off to the side, a cloth bag, and she pulled out an apple, and she slammed the apple on the table and stepped back. And Brother Andrew put up his hands, looked back at his community, said, we lost. And they looked at him, and they turned around, they started walking away. As they were walking away, they said, Brother Andrew, how did you lose? She's not even a real rabbi. How did you lose to her? And he says, I don't know, but the woman is wise beyond her appearance. He said, I tell you what I said, and as they got farther enough away where they could talk, he said, I told them that we believe in the Trinity, the three in one God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. She came back and she said, yes, but God is one God. God is one and universal with all things. I couldn't argue with that, and so I said, yes, but God spans space and time. And she came back and said, yes, but God is a very real present here and now. And I couldn't argue with that. I didn't know what else to do. I brought out the very elements of our faith, the bread and the chalice to represent Christ and his body and his blood. And then she came back with the apple to represent our sinfulness. I couldn't come up with anything she couldn't best me at. We have to leave. So the Christian community, they were preparing to leave, and they looked over at the cook, and they said to her, I'm sorry, but how did you beat Brother Andrew? The guy is really scholared. And she looked back and she says, well, I'm still not sure what happened. They said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, first of all, he looked at me and he says, you guys have 3 days to get out of town. And that scared me. I said, we'll go in one. But then he got defiant. He said, well, if you don't leave, we'll chase you out of town. And I said, never mind, we'll stand and fight. And then he brought out his lunch, and I brought out mine. Okay. It's been a while since I told that one. So I want to give you a summary of what my thoughts are. In my thinking, this is not a story of a miracle like the feeding of the 5,000. Or the rising of Lazarus from the dead, or the exorcism of demons. This is actually a story that many scholars think of as a parable of how we recognize something of ourselves, our deepest selves, and in another, we start to see that as well in the sharing of our stories, in the breaking of bread, as it were. We begin to find the hidden wholeness, the sacred, the divine, in the brokenness with one another. When we open up around a table, or when we share with vulnerability, when we begin to rise to the occasion. Now, last week I finished the sermon with this idea of rising. The 4 steps to astonishment. I talked about astonishment, which is that way in which our eyes are open and we see something we had not seen before. We recognize something we had not really seen before or recognized before. We gain an insight. We see a connection that we had no idea was there. And how do we do that? I said by relaxing, by investigating, by creating spaciousness, and by enjoying. So instead of reacting to situations, instead of resisting situations, just imagine yourself, all the people you encounter, all the stuff you see on Facebook, all the news you're hearing from day to day, and how much stress it begins to cause in you, right? Whether they're dealing with a political divisive issue or whether or not it's just the reality of stress in the news, we react to things. But instead, what would happen if we relaxed? The same thing is true then in terms of inquiring instead of insisting or instead of invoking, which is to set down what we think is the truth. We invoke that truth. We create a wall. But what happens when we investigate? What happens when we inquire? And then the third thing is that spaciousness. Instead of looking for the status quo or to keep things as they are the same, we create space. And when we create space, we find out what we don't know. Like Richard Rohr, who had said, those people who are truly, truly mystics, who truly understand the depth of spirituality, they're the ones who know they don't know. Create that spaciousness that allows us to see something, experience something that's larger than ourselves that we don't know because of the stuff we bring to the table, so to speak. And then finally, enjoy, which is not like your pleasure or my pleasure, because enjoy literally means to bring joy to the moment. It means literally to bring joy. And how do we bring joy? If you start doing these first 3 things, you start discovering things. You begin to open up as well, and joy begins to happen in those moments where you didn't think was possible. That's the idea. So we had this, go ahead to this next one. We had these journals we passed out. Avenel, who also does our coffee and provides the coffee and sometimes the refreshments, she did this one. She calls it, what was this called? Blackout Poetry. Yes, I love this idea, blackout poetry. So she was experimenting with just blacking out words on a page until you come up with words that create some other idea. Nice thing. I really like that. And then stenciling. Next one. This was sent to me from somebody over in Dallas who was at a concert. and had their journal with them. So want to see more of these. I just would like to see where you're taking your journal and just making notes, writing down a thought, or not anything. You just have your journal with you and you take it in an interesting picture. You know, wherever you are, at the gas station, take a picture with the journal, send it to Kagan, wherever Kagan is. I left you, there's Kagan. Send it to Kagan because she's posting these images as well, so I'd love for you to see that. But the idea being, these journals are really about rising to the occasion. They're about beginning to open up to the possibility of being astonished, the possibility of literally being thunderstruck, of experiencing new life. So here's this next thing. Life is filled with exquisite beauty. I ended last week with this. I'm going to end today with this, but I'll start so you see it twice. Life is filled with exquisite beauty and risk. The risk is in trusting that vision of the divine wholeness that is hidden in all things, and living with a wide enough perspective of grace and humility to be astonished in even the most unlikely of moments. And that's the challenge for us, I think, as people of faith, as people of spirituality, people who care. If we trust that hidden wholeness is present, then we take the risk, right? That's what it requires. It requires that risk. Will we be the ones to take that risk to begin to experience something else that's there? Emerson wrote this. He said, don't be too timid or squeamish about your actions. All life is an experiment. Don't be too timid or squeamish. You know that word timid? I looked it up because I always think of timid as being kind of shy, right? Kind of timid. It means frightened. It means flat out frightened. It's rooted in the word intimidated. Think of yourself at school when you were a child on the playground, and who was the bully? Right? Whoever was the bully then, you always knew there was a bully around. You always knew there was somebody who was trying to intimidate someone else. We see it today even in our politics. We see it even in our church, our denomination, intimidation. If you've been keeping up with all the emails that have been coming out from the Global Methodist Church, which is the new denomination that's kind of already started to be formed in spite of the fact that we haven't met yet. But so there's this intimidation that's going on. It's this kind of bullying. And so the response to that is frightened or angry. So timid is really a response that brings up a wall, that brings up sort of an avoidance. And I love this idea of don't be timid, don't be squeamish, experiment. So you take yourself and you experiment and you step out there. A lot of us are timid when it comes to being fully engaged with others, or taking those risks, or even timid in believing in ourselves. It's pretty easy to get overwhelmed by the bullying mentality that's out there, and it reminds us of trying to find a way to respond without being afraid. In this parable, everything that these two people had hoped for didn't happen. Literally, everything was crucified. They had hoped for the Messiah. They had hoped for a new ruler. They had hoped for the messianic leader to come in and to establish God's rule. This was what was been prophesied. And it didn't happen. Instead, he was crucified. And then the crazy stories started to happen after that. So they're walking along the road, in some sense, timid. In some sense, afraid. Because they're leaving the chaos and heading to this small village that's outside, about 7 miles away. They had been wondering all along of what had been going on. The world continued to be a chaos. The world continued to be oppressive. The world continued to be confusing. So whatever Jesus was, he didn't answer any of that. Now make that clear that whatever Jesus was, he did not address the chaos. He did not fix the confusion. He did not correct the oppression. So here we are 2,000 years later. We're afraid of our neighbor. We're afraid of the future. We're afraid of anyone who disagrees or has other opinions. All you had to do was turn on Facebook, turn on any other kind of media for the news, and you saw the announcement over the airline as the pilot was flying, and everybody cheered. And then you saw all of the different posts of people celebrating all over the place. No more masks, no more masks, no more masks on traveling. And then you saw all the reactions to that, right? We see that back and forth and back and forth. It's as if that's the only way we know how to live in the world anymore, is this back and forth, back and forth. And those who are leaving, who are disaffiliating with the United Methodist Church, they take their hard stand. And those who are staying have now taken a counter stand. And again, it's back and forth and back and forth. And it's interesting to me, this next slide, because I think about the mess that we're in, because it does feel messy at times. I mean, literally, sometimes you just turn it off because it seems so messy, it seems so chaotic, and it seems so redundant and overwhelming, you just turn it off. But that messiness is important. The messiness is what we resurrect through. The messiness is what transforms us when we live in the midst of it, when we experiment, when we take the risk. So last week, Mr. Mark, our children's minister over in the main service, he did this children's time that I saw when I watched it online later, and he showed about the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly in his children's time, and then the butterfly is not in a cocoon, right? You knew that. Butterfly is in a chrysalis, right? Butterfly is in a chrysalis. I didn't know what happens in a chrysalis. Why is a chrysalis different from a cocoon? A cocoon is where we all go when we're scared. A cocoon is where we all go when we don't want to deal with reality. We just go hide in something. A chrysalis liquefies everything. It becomes this liquefied, gooey mess. And apparently, there's the smallest amount of DNA that's actually continued into what happens to the butterfly. I mean, everything is rearranged. It's sort of like what we find ourselves now. And if we were to face some of those difficult times that we really have to deal with, if we were to face some of our own difficult moments, our own shadow kinds of issues, if we were facing those difficult people in our lives or the ones that we see online or just we encounter at the store, it gets messy. But if we don't face it, we miss the opportunity to be transformed or for them to experience that transformation. I was listening to Brene Brown, who was talking to Richard Rohr this last week. And if you put up the next slide. It was interesting because Brene Brown was saying that she talks to corporate people all the time, and they always talk about transformation. And Richard Rohr was saying, like, they don't get it, do they? And she says, well, I don't think they do. Because, it's sort of like this idea that everybody wants transformation, but nobody wants to change. And he was like, that's exactly the problem. Everyone thinks it's about transformation, but it's about change. It's about rearranging things. And the only way that happens is when we engage in the messiness. Literally, that whole idea of rising to the occasion, we get into the midst of it. Except we don't react, we relax. Like we're in the chrysalis, we just sit with it. And then we begin to explore what's there. And then we begin to create space for actual difficulty. Can you imagine that? You're sitting with somebody at a lunch counter, they're having lunch, they're starting lecturing you, they're starting to talk about their political thing, and you create space for that? Can you imagine that? And you invite them to tell you more? Can you imagine that? And you're not just listening, you're looking, right? Because you're looking to see where the hidden wholeness is. Because you know, and I know, the wholeness that's hidden in all things is there too. It's there too. How are you going to find it? They can't find it. They're ready to leave. They're ready to take everything and go away, or else overrun you and take everything over. They just don't recognize it. So we have to get in the messiness of it. And that's the challenge, to experience transformation. It's the word in our mission statement, right? In our denomination's mission statement, make disciples of Jesus Christ for the... Oh, come on, people. Y'all are still Methodists. Make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. What does that mean? To change it. But you can't change it until we change ourselves. So, a couple of last thoughts here. Let's see this next one. So Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton, some of you all remember Thomas Merton, who was a Jesuit monk. He was back in the middle of the 20th century. He had studied to be a priest, and he had really thought of himself being like the up-and-coming next priest, cardinal, who knew where he would end up, but he really had high aspirations for himself. He was aggressive, he was a type A personality, he was alienating, which is really interesting when you think about who Thomas Merton was, because we all think of him as the gentle monk who walked around with Thich Nhat Hanh and others. But Thomas Merton started his life early as a type A personality, ready to succeed in being the best priest ever. And then one day, he'd sort of had this reckoning with his own ego, and he was standing at a corner in Lexington, Kentucky, where he'd been going to seminary. And he looked out, and it just hit him all of a sudden. It literally hit him. He was literally astonished, because as he looked at everyone, he suddenly began to feel this kinship. And then not simply a kinship, he suddenly began to feel there was something hidden that they all shared in, something at the depth of their being, which he later came to call this hidden wholeness, that they were all one with one another, they were all one with all of life, they were all participating in this same hidden reality, but often not aware of it. And it literally changed how he saw everything, because he no longer saw himself being at the lead. He saw himself in you. He saw you in himself. There was no place for someone being at the top, because we were all part of the same reality. It literally took who he was as if he'd been in a chrysalis, and it rearranged him. So I want to finish with this last quote, because the idea that I want to... No, I'm sorry, the next one. Yeah. I love this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's kind of like my little mantra. It's a serious thing just to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world. Do you see that? It's a serious thing. It's an amazing thing to be alive on this fresh morning in this broken world. That's what we move about with from moment to moment. That's the risk we take as we engage with one another, is we recognize this mess we're in, and we allow some space to let the wholeness come through, to claim it as it comes through. That's the challenge. So, last one, ended as I started. Life is filled with this exquisite beauty and risk. And the risk is in trusting that vision of the divine wholeness hidden in all things and living with a wide enough perspective of grace and humility to be astonished in even the most unlikely of moments. That's the risk that we are invited to take. That's what it means to be a disciple of Christ. To transform the world, we have to invite ourselves into these chrysalis moments and to literally be broken enough in order to be rearranged with others in a way that they begin to see the hidden wholeness too. Amen.